Hello, I'm Madeline Navigato, and I analyze the difference in resource usage between plant-based and animal-based protein. We're comparing the total land use, which is in cropland and pasture in hectares. We're also going to look at the water use, which is irrigation and rainwater in cubic meters of water. M3, total food-related emissions from agricultural supply chains in metric tons of CO2. And we're also going to measure how much of plants and how much of animal protein by per ton of protein and how much food was purchased by kilogram. The data was collected from Janet Ranganatha. She is the Vice President for Research Data and Innovation at the World Resources Institute. She published this really interesting study called Creating a Sustainable Food Future, a menu of solutions to feed nearly 10 billion people by 2050. Figured this was a really reliable source given her role. It was very recent data, and I had the ability to contact her if I had any questions. I had difficulties obtaining data that avoided my confirmation bias. I have been vegetarian since I've been in 5th grade. I've been a recent vegan, and I've always heard about how meat uses so much more resources than plants, and I really wanted to make sure that I just found data that was actually solid. I stumbled upon a lot of random Google Sheets that just had these really arbitrary figures. When I did get in contact with Janet, she provided me just so much data, and it was all in an Excel spreadsheet. I had to change some headers because when I pulled out all the columns, it was just getting like the formatted name instead of like the actual column name that was going to help me distinguish which data I wanted to actually use. One of the data sources that I had access to. So the read Excel function in the pandas library was pulling these just headers as the column name. And there was another issue that was coming where these extra rows was pulling NaN inputs from here. And here's a little snippet of the other data. It's just a lot. And then the same thing that happened, I had to go ahead and actually delete these because they had nothing associated with them. So I used this read Excel function. I only used certain columns for analysis. And then I had to use the drop NA just to drop those NA variables. I had to do the same thing when I implement the next as well. So we're going to compare land usage between animal proteins per ton and land usage of plant proteins per ton. I purposely did them in 2 separate plots just so we could see the comparison in keeping the same X-ticks between plant-based proteins and animal-based proteins. We see that there is a huge significance between these top 3 land users of animal-based proteins and the top 3 land users of the plant-based proteins. On average, that plant-based proteins use about 1.96 hectares of land compared to animal-based proteins 14.74. And I wanted to just look at the lowest land user, which are farmed fish, compared to all of plant-based protein. Farmed fish is coming in at 2.12 hectares of land compared to the average of plant-based proteins at 1.96 hectares. Farm fish is getting surpassed by soy and nuts, but it is still bigger than roots and tubers, pulses, maize, rice, and wheat. Importance of minimizing our land usage is to conserve the land. Land conservation is important because lands support us. They provide clean water, clean air. They provide flood control, storm protection, food. It's important to sustain our way of living. It's also important to talk about water. First, looking at these plots, nuts are a significant user of water, and it is significant between all the other plant proteins and all of the animal proteins combined. If we do take out that anomaly of nuts, we do see that plant proteins do use less water than animal proteins. I did compare the two on average, including a huge factor of nuts in this average, and still plant-based proteins do use less than animal-based proteins. And now I want to just look at these resource usage comparatively, land being on the left y-axis and water on the right y-axis. These are sorted by their increasing use of land, but there's also water in here as well. Beef use a lot of water and a lot of land compared to wheat or rice or maize. I'm not ever forgetting about the nuts. Nuts use so much water. In general, plant-based proteins do use less water and land than animal-based proteins. So I did want to look at the difference between the lowest user of land and water versus the highest user of land and water on the opposite sides of the spectrum. We see that soy uses significantly less usage of land and water than beef does. Soy is one of the most popular ingredients in beef alternative as well as a lot of other animal protein alternatives. It is important to look at what you are demanding for food. If you are trying to be a more conscious eater, it is important to make little swaps in your diet. The next thing I wanted to look at was carbon emissions. So this I used a new data set. This one compares plant-based items versus animal items, not just proteins, and it measures it per kilogram purchased. So I wanted to differentiate between animal list and a plant list like I did earlier. So I first started by just summing up all of the food that was purchased and all of the carbon emissions and just compared the two. So we can see that plants were purchased far more than animal items were purchased because this includes like all of the things like spices, beer, fruits and vegetables, pastas, just everything that is produced from plants. So just to visualize this difference, we see that plant-based items are purchased way more than animal-based items, almost doubled, but the amount of CO2 that is produced from animal-based items is far more significant than plant-based items. So now I thought it'd be interesting to compare the top 5 most purchased animal products and the top 5 most purchased plant products, and then compare their food-related emissions. Just sort by the amounts purchased in kilograms. So we see that cow's milk is coming in as the most purchased item of food, and then below that is other vegetables. So other vegetables includes anything other than cabbage, tomato, root vegetables, onions, leeks. I wanted to look at their amount of CO2 that was produced. So although beef and buffalo meat is only coming in at 71,000 kilograms, it is producing nearly triple the amount that the next emission is coming in at. So although it is nearly purchased the least amount of this list, it is producing far more than anything else here. And then we can see that the next thing that's coming in, vegetables was purchased second. They produce 199 tons of carbon emissions. So this is a huge significant difference between the two. And I wanted to just visualize these on just a chart. So out of all of these combined, beef and buffalo meat are producing 42%. Below that is cow's milk, and then pork, meat, poultry, and then rye bread is the amount of carbon emissions that's produced is potatoes. Why is the amount of carbon emissions released important? Well, carbon emissions are what creates what's known as a greenhouse gas, and it is important to have greenhouse gas because if we didn't have greenhouse gases, then the entire Earth would just be a frozen block of ice. So an amount of greenhouse gas is important to have, but too many greenhouse gases creates this warming effect, which starts to melt places and ecosystems that we don't necessarily want to melt. So to discuss the next steps in this section, if I were to have a better statistical background, I feel like I could have grabbed more important measurements and visualizations from the data that was provided to me. So hopefully in the next few years, I do get a better statistical background so I can make more fun visualizations and statistical analysis of the data that I did have. Also, I felt like a lot of my data was actually comparison. It would be really interesting to have some kind of forecasting model to see kind of what would happen if we were just keeping the same state of life we have now and what that would look like in 50 years from now. In all, thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Hopefully this informed you on the difference between plant-based and animal-based proteins, and hopefully encourage you to make a more conscious choice to demanding less resource-intensive foods.